So to start off, about 3 years ago, when SharePoint 2010 first came out, that was the first time that Microsoft had put in a taxonomy feature, and it was called the Term Store. And one of the questions that Microsoft got quite a bit was, we like this feature, but we don't really have a taxonomy. How do we get started? So Wand developed a partnership with Microsoft, and we made one of our taxonomies, our general business taxonomy, available as a free download for users of SharePoint 2010. And a lot of you on the call today may have actually downloaded that taxonomy sometime in the past. Now, since then, we've had about 7,000 companies have downloaded that taxonomy, and we've had an opportunity to speak to many of them. And the things that we hear again and again are kind of distilled down into these 4 points on this slide. What are the common challenges? And the first is that search is difficult in SharePoint. In a lot of cases, SharePoint's kind of become a dumping ground for a lot of documents. They're not well organized. And the SharePoint search by itself hasn't really left a very good taste in people's mouth. That people can't really find the documents that they're looking for. And a big driver of that is that the search brings back a lot of results, but it doesn't give you the ways to effectively refine those results based on what the document is about. So people can't find what they're looking for. Next, the term store is a valuable feature. Companies acknowledge that, but a lot of people don't have a taxonomy or a term set. So how do you get started? A third thing we hear a lot is that the people are getting frustrated with folder-based organization of information. Folder-based information is really trying to take what worked offline in a filing cabinet and bring it into an electronic world where a single document goes into a single location, and you need to know what folder that document is in order to find it. Unfortunately, I've witnessed, and I'm sure all of you can appreciate this, I've witnessed a lot of folder structures that have become very nested and very out of control over time because everyone builds their own folders, they use their own terms, they put things in a place where they think they'll remember them, but it doesn't really make sense to anybody else. We've certainly seen folder structures in SharePoint and on share drives that go 10, 11 levels deep, believe it or not. So that really just doesn't work, and the larger you get, the worse off it is. So people want to move away from folders and really more towards a tagging type approach, which is what taxonomy enables, and we'll talk a little bit more about the value of that later. And last, once again, how do we build our taxonomy? We know we need a taxonomy, and we kind of begin to see that there's value to that, but how do we get started? Wand is not the only one sort of evangelizing the value of taxonomies. This is from a report from Gartner called the Enterprise Content Management Maturity Model that they released last year. And I'll include a link to this complete report in the follow-up materials tomorrow. But this is just a screenshot from the report. And you can see that Gartner has developed a 5-level grading of companies based on their maturity in their approach to enterprise content management. And if you look and you look at level 4, level 5, enterprise and transformative, kind of the higher levels, you see things like extensive meta tagging of content, content standards. Within the report, it talks a lot about taxonomies. So taxonomies and tagging are not the only components that Gartner calls out, but they really do say that these are 2 critical components to becoming a transformative organization as far as enterprise content management. And that's because metadata really is important, and taxonomy really is it's strategic. So I've already committed the sin of using a few jargon terms, so let's go ahead and define them. So what do I actually mean when I say tagging? And tagging simply means applying metadata to documents. I actually like to go a little bit further when talking about metadata, and what do we mean by metadata? The colloquial definition that a lot of people know is metadata is simply data about data. And what I do is break that up a little bit further, and there's 2 types of metadata that you should be aware of. The first is what I call flag metadata. Some people call it administrative metadata. That's things like file type, file size, author, edited by date, a lot of the things that the computer is going to apply automatically. So if you were to right-click on the Properties panel within a Word document, you'd see a lot of that flag metadata, and it would be populated. The computer does it for you. It's really easy to get. Unfortunately, it's not particularly helpful for finding things. When is the last time anybody searched for a document that was 27 kilobytes and is a Word document and was edited in March? It may happen once in a while, but not very frequently. And certainly that's not how we search for things on the general internet on Google. So what we're talking about today is really the second category of metadata, which I would call descriptive metadata. And that's one or multiple words about the content of the document. What customer is this about? What business process is this about? Is this a paid time off form? Is it a W-2 form? These are the types of metadata that are driven by the taxonomy, and that when tagged to a document really speaks to the aboutness of a document. What's the content of this document? And that's what people need to be able to do effective search. So the content of the webinar and our discussion today is really all about that descriptive metadata and how can we get to that. And within SharePoint specifically, it's those tags of the descriptive metadata which are going to drive the search refinements in SharePoint 2010 and SharePoint 2013. So that's where a lot of the value is going to come in for your end users. So that's what tagging is. Now, taxonomy. What's a taxonomy? That's another kind of buzzword that I think people are talking more about, but let's define it. So taxonomy, very simply, and you can see an example of a manufacturing taxonomy to the right. It's just a collection of terms around a given topic that's been organized into a hierarchical tree structure. If you think of a tree structure, think of your family tree. You have parents, grandparents, children. That's analogous to a taxonomy. Here we have a term, capacity planning. It has a parent term of manufacturing planning, and it may have children terms or narrower terms. There are more specific types of capacity planning. And really, the reason we have this taxonomy is it's an important set of business terminology. It's going to allow us to organize our unstructured content. It's going to allow us to tag that text, giving context to the information and supplementing our keyword search. And at the very basic level, I think this third bullet point is the one you want to remember. It's the individual categories or the terms from the taxonomy which are going to be tagged to the documents. So it's really a set of potential descriptive metadata values, a set of potential tags which can be applied to your documents. We already talked a little bit about the structure of the taxonomy, but we can just define it more succinctly. There's really 4 basic elements that you should be aware of within your taxonomy, and specifically within SharePoint. They've kept it pretty simple. You have your term name. That might be called a preferred term. In this case, it's foreign exchange. And foreign exchange isn't the only way to talk about the concept. We might also have synonyms such as foreign currencies or FX. That's allowing us to take the same different ways of saying the same concept and normalizing it into the same preferred concept so that everyone's speaking the same language inside the organization. And then again, there's the tree structure that's actually organizing these preferred terms. So in this case, foreign exchange has a broader term or a parent term of asset types, and it has a narrower term or a child term of Australian dollar, which is a more specific type of foreign exchange. So you can see how the concepts can be related to each other so that people can find what they're looking for. So generally, that's a brief primer on what taxonomies are. Within the enterprise, taxonomies serve a few different purposes. Very broadly, we say that taxonomies are the data model for unstructured information, and we use that analogy for anyone who's done data warehousing and working with more quantitative, well-structured information. There's a corresponding data model in that world. So we say the same thing, that the taxonomy is providing some structure or some context and a model to organize your unstructured information so you can get out the information from that unstructured information that you need. That's essentially a representation of how an organization organizes information, or how an enterprise organizes information. That's what you want to begin to think about is when you're thinking of your taxonomy, is what are the important concepts inside my organization and how do they relate to each other? And that's really what we want to reflect in the taxonomy for tagging. It's a common language for your organization. Again, as I already kind of covered, it's the taxonomies. In SharePoint specifically, that's what you're going to use to tag the documents. And then once your information is tagged, people will be able to refine their search results and browse through this information using the taxonomy. So to sum up, this will be our last PowerPoint slide until we jump into the demo. Why taxonomy for SharePoint? We know what tagging is, we know what taxonomy is, but in SharePoint, frankly, a lot of documents and a lot of content just doesn't have appropriate metadata now, and it's that descriptive metadata again. And a big reason it wasn't well supported in earlier versions of SharePoint. Even if people have been using SharePoint 2010, they may not have invested the time in developing a taxonomy and in pushing tagging out to the community. Shared drives, where a lot of people hold content, certainly can become a mess, and it's very rare that we see that anyone has tagged content that they put into a shared drive. I certainly, and I'm a taxonomy professional, I certainly don't manually add the metadata to a Word document when I create it. I just put it in a folder and try to find it later. So as a result, you don't have that good metadata, so there's a broad dissatisfaction with search. And that's really what we're after here, is how can we organize information so that search is better and more efficient for the end user. And taxonomy is a tool that's going to allow people to filter search results and improve their relevance, and that's what people are really after. Taxonomy can also enhance the social capabilities of SharePoint with the My Sites and the My Profiles and the ability to subscribe to news feeds and index yourselves to certain skills. All that can be driven by a taxonomy because you really want your organization to be speaking the same language again. To be social, you need to speak the same language. And that's what taxonomy is offering, a common vocabulary, a common language. And then finally, certainly SharePoint 2010 added a lot of value around bringing metadata and taxonomy to the table. But metadata is even more important to the search in SharePoint 2010, or in SharePoint 2013, I should say. There's been a big enhancement to the search engine in SharePoint 2013 versus the SharePoint 2010 search. Microsoft brought in a lot of the features of FAST and just integrated them out of the box. So the search in SharePoint 2013 can benefit and really, in many regards, is driven by metadata more than ever before. So if you're serious about SharePoint, it really makes sense to invest the time in taxonomy. With that, I'm going to exit these PowerPoint slides and we'll go over to our demonstration. So the feature in SharePoint that allows you to use taxonomy is called the Manage Metadata Service. And actually, let me, I glanced at one of the questions, so let me take a quick break and point out we're going to be looking at the demo in SharePoint 2013. The Manage Metadata Service and the Term Store are similar in SharePoint 2013 and 2010. There are a few enhancements and new features in SharePoint 2013. Most of what we'll be looking at today is going to be common amongst both, but I will highlight the differences and we'll briefly look at what the Term Store looks like in SharePoint 2010. So that will be covered. But again, the feature that allows for taxonomy in either case is the Manage Metadata Service, and the user interface for the Manage Metadata Service is called the Term Store. And that's where you're going to manage your taxonomy. So first, how do we actually get to the Term Store? And you can access it through Central Admin. And you can also access it through Site Settings. So if you want someone to manage taxonomies you don't want to give Central Admin access to, that's very possible. So don't let that be a barrier. But for the purposes of this, we're just going to access it through Central Admin. And Under Application Management, you'll want to click on Manage Service Applications. And as always, servers tend to be a little bit slower when you're doing a demo or a webinar. Bear with me for one moment. Okay, here we go. So click on Manage Service Applications, and the one we want to click on to go navigate to is the Manage Metadata Service. If you don't see the Manage Metadata Service on the list, it might be that it hasn't been enabled yet. So you just need to go in and kickstart it, and then it will show up on this list. So we're going to click on the Manage Metadata Service, and that is going to take us to the Term Store. So again, the Term Store is going to be your main interface for developing your taxonomies. It's an administrative interface, so your end users would never actually interact with this environment. But this is the basic structure of the Term Store. It's laid out, so on the left-hand panel you have your term sets or your taxonomies. On your right-hand panel, you're going to have various administrative options depending on where you are, what level you're at in the left-hand side. So what we're going to do in the next 10 minutes is go through each of the levels and talk about the various administrative options. So by the end of this, you should have a good idea of the things you can or cannot do inside of the Term Store. So at the very top level, we have a Manage Metadata Service. Again, that's the service that allows you to have taxonomies and to syndicate and share them across different sites. It also allows you to syndicate and share content types, but for today's conversation, we're just focused on the term sets. So at the Manage Metadata Service level, you have a few administrative options. The first is one that you most likely will not use, but it allows you to choose which Manage Metadata Service you want to work on. I have very, very rarely, I actually can't think of any clients that we have that are using more than one, but it is possible. But most likely you'll just have one choice here. Next, you have a sample import. This is a place you can just download a sample import file. It's going to be in the same format that you would have gotten the WAND General Business Taxonomy in. Just something to be aware of. If you want to know how do I load a taxonomy into the Term Store, this is the format you're going to use. Next is who are the Term Store administrators. These are just the folks that are kind of the super administrators of the Term Store. They're going to be able to create groups, which we'll talk about in a moment, but groups are basically the main way that you control who can manage what taxonomies. Next, the next two are going to be important or interesting if you're an international organization or you have more than one language. You're going to want to choose what's our primary language. For us, it's English, but the primary language is what is the taxonomy basically going to be constructed in. Every term needs to have a name in this primary language. And then underneath, you can choose working languages. So if I had an office down in Mexico, I might want to have Spanish as a working language so that I could translate my taxonomy into that other language. Once we open up our Manage Metadata Service here on the left, you're going to see this next level kind of look like folders, but these are actually term groups. Term groups are your main governance capability inside of the Term Store. This is how you're going to control who manages which taxonomies. So inside SharePoint, you can have more than one taxonomy. They would be called term sets. So you may have a term set for customer segment, and you may have one for human resources, and you may have one for legal that are all used to tag documents in different libraries. And if you want to control which people manage them, you can set up the group. So you might have a sales term group, and put your customer segment and your sales and marketing taxonomy in there. And you might have a human resources term group and put the human resources term set in there. Then, using these administrative options, you can assign group managers and contributors, and those people will actually be able to make changes to the taxonomies within those groups. Nobody else will be able to. So this is really this is the only way that you control who makes changes to what taxonomies inside the term store. The only other distinctions or administrative options for at the group level, what's the group name? You can really call that however you want. It's only going to show up in the term store. And then a description. It might just be a good idea to provide some context. I set this group up because I want the human resources team to manage their own taxonomies, and that's the purpose of it. Whoever is a group manager will be able to assign different contributors or remove contributors. Contributors are only going to be able to make changes to the terms within those taxonomies in that group. They won't be able to add group managers, of course. So there's a little bit of a hierarchy in the roles. So once we have our term groups, we're going to open them up. And finally, we're finally looking at some taxonomies. And these are what we would call term sets. I call them taxonomies, but the SharePoint term is actually term sets. And each term set can also have its own administrative option. So here's a geography term set, and we can have a term set name, geography, pretty self-explanatory. The description, that's a good idea, again, to give some context of what this term set it was developed for, why do we have it. That way, if you need to have a new manager, if a few people are managing it, everyone can kind of be on the same page. In this case, this is just for our demo, but this term set contains a set of cities where SharePoint Saturdays have been held. So that's my description. Owner is just the primary owner of the term set. It's really just kind of for administrative purposes. Don't get confused and think that this is a security setting. Again, security and that permissions are only handled at the group level. So that can be confusing. You want to keep that clear. Contact, that's simply just an email address. It's not a particularly sophisticated feedback mechanism, but it is a way that if an end user wants to suggest a new term in the taxonomy when they're tagging, there's a button they can click, and that's just going to trigger an email to this contact person. Stakeholders are people who might be users of this term group. It may be, I might have a library that leverages this term set. And so if you're going to make any major changes to the term set, I want to be notified. It would be a good idea to make me a stakeholder. Last, and probably maybe the most important of the term set administrative options, is submission policy. And a term set can either be open or closed. And what that basically means is when a term set is open, it means that an end user out in SharePoint would actually be able to add new terms to the term set directly without suggesting it. If it's closed, that means an end user would only be able to suggest a new term via this feedback mechanism, but they wouldn't be able to make any changes themselves. We suggest as a best practice, unless you have a compelling business reason otherwise, that you keep every term set closed. And the reason for that is that your end users are not going to be trained in taxonomies. They won't be sophisticated about taxonomies. They may not be familiar with the complete taxonomy. So if you keep it closed, you can keep it under control. If you leave it open, what you'll see is that you'll see duplicate terms added, you'll see misspellings, you'll see terms added in the wrong spot, and it can kind of get out of control, much in the way that folder structures do. So best practice, keep it closed unless you can have a specific reason otherwise. And there's other mechanisms you can use to capture some of the user keywords that you may want to capture. Finally, we've gone down through manage metadata service, term groups, term sets. We're finally at the meat of the subject and the taxonomy terms themselves, or the tags. You can see that under geography, each of these are possible tags, and there's a hierarchy to them, so we can expand these and see our more narrow terms. So there are a few administrative options specifically for each of the terms in your taxonomy, and we can see these over on the right. First one, is it available for tagging or not? So that's an interesting one. You say, well, why would you have a term in the taxonomy and not make it available for tagging? The reason for this is that some terms in the taxonomy might not be valuable tags themselves, but they might be good organizational terms. And North America is a really good example of that. Remember, this geography term set was created to list the cities where SharePoint Saturdays have been held. Now, North America is not a city where SharePoint Saturdays have been held. So we probably don't want people to tag content to North America. But rather than have a long list of every city on Earth, it's helpful to organize them by these regions. So we created the regions of North America, Europe, and Asia Pacific, but we don't want those used as tags. So for North America, I'm going to uncheck it and save. And now you'll see that it's still in the taxonomy, but the term is going to be grayed out. So what that means is when an end user comes to tag, they'll be able to navigate by North America and see this breakdown, but if they try to tag a document with North America, it will indicate to them that they should probably expand it and choose one of these specific city names. So we go further down at the term level, and you can choose what language you're going to edit. Again, every term in your primary language is going to have a descriptor, but if you wanted to add the translation, you would just do the drop down here. Here you can add a definition. So I'm going to say that the Twin Cities is a term referring to the combination of Minneapolis and St. Paul. We'll see how this, remember this definition, I'll show you how it pops up a little bit later. Default label, that's just kind of what we want to call the term. That's the term name. And then other labels are basically synonyms. So I could imagine somebody checking in a document and maybe they think to tag it to Minneapolis, but really we want to use Twin Cities in this case. Same with St. Paul, and maybe somebody spells out St. Paul for some reason. So these are all now our synonyms, and we'll save these. And remember those again, I'll show you when we do tagging how the synonyms add value. So those are all the administrative options for Manage Metadata Service, term groups, term sets, and terms themselves. So we've seen how you'd sort of go through that for each individual terms, but you can also use the term store, of course, to manage or make changes to existing taxonomies. And you're going to just do that on the left-hand panel. And let's say we want to add a new city. We just simply right-click on North America, and we'd create a new term. And I'm going to add Fort Collins, which is a city here in Colorado. And now we have a new term, Fort Collins. So it's that easy to add a new term. And you can make other changes as well. So again, if we right-click, we can really see all the editing options that we can do to the tree. One, we could copy a term. So if I want to use a term and put it somewhere else as well, I can copy a term with the children. That would basically copy the entire branch. I can reuse a term. That's very similar to copying. We should be familiar with the differences. Copying means I'm actually creating a new copy, a new instance of the term with a different unit in the database. So the terms are no longer linked. It's just taking the text and replicating it. Reusing is keeping the same term but putting it elsewhere. So the same term with the same unit appears in more than one place. Pinning a term, I think, is like reusing it, but with brings the children along as well. Merging terms is basically combining two terms together. One of them would become the default name or the preferred term. The other would become the synonym. Deprecating terms basically means we're not going to use that term anymore, but we don't want to delete it. So let's say that the Fort Collins SharePoint Saturday was a bust. We'll deprecate that. No new content is going to be tagged to Fort Collins, but we want to keep the term for historical purposes. And then the last two, moving a term, fairly self-explanatory. That's actually going to move it to another location entirely. And finally, deleting a term is going to eliminate that term. We don't recommend deleting terms, particularly once they've been in use, but when you're doing your initial development of the taxonomy, you would certainly have use for deleting a term. The last thing to be aware of in the term store is this system term group, kind of below this dotted line, below the fold. And the system term group is going to be where you're going to be able to see what sorts of keywords or tags are people using out in the SharePoint ecosystem. Here you can see hashtags. Hashtags, if you're familiar with Twitter, are just a way to highlight a topic. So you would just do, the pound sign SharePoint Saturday, and that would tag a post or tag a document. Those will show up here. What's more interesting perhaps are these keywords. Keywords come from two places. First, when you import your documents into SharePoint, if they happen to have any descriptive metadata associated with them, any tags that people have added, which happens from time to time, those will be imported and they'll be saved or placed here in this managed keyword set. The other place you get keywords is within SharePoint. If you've opened up any fields to allow for free text keywords, the tags and notes feature is one place that allows you to do that. Anything people add there will be added to this keywords group as well. So this is a really good thing from an ongoing basis and a governance standpoint. We suggest that you always come through and review these keywords for a couple of reasons. One, you just want to make sure that the list sort of stays clean and there's nothing untoward that you don't want to cleanse out, which we certainly have seen. The second thing is that you can see the types of keywords that people are adding, and maybe they've used acronyms that you weren't aware of or new customer names. So it can be a really nice source of terminology that could potentially be promoted into one of your taxonomies up above. So if we scroll down, we say, oh, here's seabeds. That's actually an acronym for a term we have above. We'd simply right-click, move it, and put it in one of the taxonomies up above. And then we could merge it with its preferred name, and then seabeds would be a synonym, and it would preserve the integrity of wherever this term had been tagged. So managed keywords are down below, managed terms are up above. Good idea to keep an eye on managed keywords as you move forward. A few other things to point out about the term store that are SharePoint 2013 specific that I won't go into in depth on this call, but primarily you can see the search dictionaries, and there's a few different sort of term sets, but you can see they have different icons. These are term sets that are built into SharePoint 2013 to allow you to manage some search capabilities. So here you can do query spelling, inclusions and exclusions. These are term sets that help you manage the did you mean feature of the SharePoint 2013 search. So if you are in the food service business, you might want to add the term restaurant because that's commonly spelled. So if somebody did a search for R-E-S-T-A-R-A-N-T, it would review the query spelling inclusions and look for the best match. And if it saw restaurant spelled correctly, it would present a did you mean restaurant to the end user. And exclusions actually does the opposite. It will not suggest that term. Then company exclusions and inclusions, those are some very light metadata extraction capabilities that SharePoint has built in. Basically, if let's say you were a financial research firm and you wanted to pull out the names of any Fortune 500s that appeared in your text, you could load those company names here. And then when SharePoint indexed them, they would automatically pull those names out and add them to a special metadata field that would show up as filters in your search. So not full-on automatic tagging, certainly, but SharePoint and Microsoft have dipped their toes into some entity extraction concepts within the search dictionaries. This is what the term store looks like in SharePoint 2010. You can see it's kind of got the older-fashioned style and design, but many of the features are very much the same. You have the same administrative options at the Manage Metadata Service level, at the term group level, as well as the term set and the term level. So everything we just looked at for SharePoint 2013, you're going to be able to use inside of SharePoint 2010 as well. So that's our Term Store 101. Now that we've built some taxonomies, let's go look and see how do they actually get applied to documents. So here's a library that we created for SharePoint Saturday, and I'm going to open it up. And you'll see that it's just a bunch of, it's the collateral or administrative documents for SharePoint Saturdays. And we've created two columns that are tied to the Manage Metadata. One is conference location, which you can see is populated by city names. And then the second is document content. What is this document about? Is it about schedules or venues or calls for speaker? So from an end user perspective, I'm going to come into SharePoint, and in SharePoint 2013, I can either add a new document or I can drag files in. I'm just going to add one like this. And go to my sample documents. I wanted to add this sponsor document for Minnesota, the Twin Cities. So I'm going to add this document. When you add a document, as you know, the Properties panel is going to come up, and it's going to ask the user to fill in metadata for the various fields that we have established. And here you can see we have our conference location. And remember, this is for the Twin Cities, but I'm just thinking of, we're going to Minneapolis, so I'm going to type in Minneapolis. You begin to see the value of taxonomies here, of the synonyms. Type in Minneapolis. Remember, we had added that as a synonym. It's recognized, but it's suggesting that the tag I really want is Twin Cities, so I'm going to choose that. Document content. I can use type ahead, but I can also click on this tag icon on the right, and I can browse through the taxonomies. And this is a small list, but I'm going to choose, this was about sponsors, so I'll choose that. And hit OK. I can save it, and now that document has been added with the appropriate metadata, Twin Cities. Here it is, Twin Cities and sponsors. Now, let's look at how we actually set up a column and associate it with the appropriate metadata that we want. There's two ways you can approach this in SharePoint. By default, when you set up SharePoint, there's going to be a column called Enterprise Keywords that's going to be a default site-wide column. Enterprise keywords can be populated with terms from any term in any taxonomy. So if you just want a quick and dirty way to do it and to have people access the taxonomies and do tagging, you can set up that single column and every tag will go into that same column. Or the other approach is to set up specific columns based on what you want it to be populated with. So in this case, we wanted this to be city. This we wanted to be document content. The way you do that is you're going to go to Library and Create Column. And you give it a name. When you create a column, you need to choose what type of metadata should be associated with that column. And in this case, we want that descriptive metadata. So we're going to choose the last radio button, Manage Metadata. What that's going to do is it's going to refresh this panel and give me a window into the term store. And this should look pretty familiar. And I can open it up and choose which taxonomy do I want to be valid values for this column. I'm going to choose this SharePoint Saturday organizational term set. It's just kind of a made-up term set. And you see we have the webinar column. And I can either add values one by one for each document by viewing the properties, or in SharePoint 2013 for the first time they've created this quick edit view. Not available in 2010, but it's a big benefit for 2013, where it gives me kind of a spreadsheet-like view, a grid view, and I can just go through and tag each item. And I can even drag and drop or copy my way down. There we go. And I can still use the type ahead as well, fiscal year, etc. So if you're doing manual tagging, this is a great feature to be aware of. It's a much more efficient to add metadata this way rather than opening up the properties panel of each individual document. We'll stop editing that. So the last thing to kind of be aware of at the library level is once the metadata is applied, I can actually use it within a library to filter the information. So by clicking across the top, I can say, you know, I really just want to see documents related to Cincinnati, and it's going to filter it like that. So that's another way, that's one way that metadata is going to benefit your users outside of the scope of search for allowing them to filter information within a library, and we see a lot of value out of that. So let's go close the gap, or close the loop, and show how is taxonomy going to benefit end users actually when they're doing searches. And that's really what people are mostly after. How can I add value to, and efficiency to my user searching experience? So the first thing I want to show is SharePoint 2010 search. And I'm just going to do a search for SharePoint. So this is the SharePoint 2010 out-of-the-box enterprise search. And you can see we have 51 results. And on the left-hand side, these are the SharePoint 2010 refiners. If we go to the bottom, we're going to see location and terms from our taxonomy. These should look pretty familiar. Here's document content. So I can click on Kansas City, and I have 2 documents. And if I wanted to go further, I could say sponsors, and now I have the 1 document that I'm interested in. So that's the very basic. It's not a great presentation in SharePoint 2010 out of the box, but it shows you how managed metadata is going to benefit for your end user for their search experience. They can filter those results. And in 2 clicks, go from 51 documents down to 1 document. 51 documents, not that intimidating, but imagine the power of going from 5,000 documents to 3 documents in a couple of clicks. Really shows the power of how taxonomy is going to improve relevance. Next, let's look at the very same search, or almost the same search, in SharePoint 2013. And this is the SharePoint 2013 out-of-the-box search. I think here you'll see that there is a compelling reason to, if you're deciding between 2010 and 2013, there is a compelling reason from a search standpoint to move to 2013 because the experience is really much richer. Same type of result set. Here on the left-hand side, we're going to see our geography taxonomy. And instead of just a raw list, SharePoint 2013 shows the taxonomy with its full hierarchy. And it's only showing results for which I have documents. So you can see there's nothing for Fort Collins because I don't have any documents tagged to Fort Collins. But I can click again on Kansas City, and then I can refine by other taxonomies, and again, sponsors. So the document counts are a huge benefit. It's really providing an Amazon-style search result for your enterprise documents. So if I go to Amazon and I search for televisions, more than 700,000 results, if you can believe it. But if I filter by brand and screen size and price, those are all metadata values, I can quickly get it down to 5 results, the 5 televisions that are most important to me. That's what we're trying to deliver. That's the value that you want to provide to your end users, and metadata helps you do that. I can show another example with a few more documents. This is some documents we crawled from the FDIC site. I'm just going to do a basic search for the word bank. And you can see 2,300 results. And it's too many, but what I'm really interested in is the Dodd-Frank Act. So I'm going to go to U.S. banking legislation, and here's the Dodd-Frank Act, and I would expect to see 26 documents. And maybe I want to go a little bit further, deposit account agreements, and now I just have 3 documents. So 2,300 results down to 3, and all that is driven by the taxonomy and the metadata. Again, letting people do a general keyword search that they're used to, but then presenting them with highly relevant terms or concepts to their business that they can filter by, the aboutness of the document. So the last thing I want to show, and then we'll wrap up the slides and go to Q&A. We've shown how you manage taxonomies. We've shown how you set up columns and use taxonomies at the library level. We've shown how you can manually tag documents out of the box in SharePoint and search for them. There's really 2 approaches to tagging. One is the manual approach that SharePoint offers, but you can also do an automated approach. And Wand has a solution called Data Facet that I briefly want to demonstrate to show you what that looks like. So we'll go to this finance library, and this time I'm going to do a drag and drop. I'm going to bring in this document, 10 Myths About Subprime Mortgages. What's happening now is the Wand Data Facet engine, or it should have been, is indexing the text of the document, and based on rules that we've set up, let me try that one again, it should be automatically applying metadata to this document at the time that it's checked in. And of course, then let me delete this and give it one more try. But the long and the short of it is we'll get onto the next steps. You basically want to decide what is your tagging strategy going to be. Do you want to do manual tagging, or do you want to come up with an automated approach that's going to remove that burden of tagging from your end users? Again, there's business justifications for either, but it is something that you just want to think about as you're putting together your taxonomy strategy. And for whatever reason, it's not liking me on the demo. So we'll move on to the remainder of the slides. If you have any questions about automatic tagging, that's certainly something we can explore with you subsequent to this webinar. So to wrap up, there's 3 things you need to think about. How do you get started? And there's 3 things. 1, you need to build your taxonomies. Develop a tagging plan, and then your ongoing governance so that it continues to work going forward. So some advice for building your term sets. 1, we recommend your business users be involved. Not necessarily that the business users do the taxonomy building. We've seen a lot of projects stall and fail because companies have put a committee together, and it's had members from various teams and their business users, but they didn't have any taxonomy experience. And what we see is it could take 6, 9, 12 months, and not a lot of progress gets made. So get them involved, get their feedback, talk to end users, understand how do they want to search for information, what terms are important to them, what documents are important to them. See if you can get them to share some of those documents, understand what terms are important for those documents, and then leave them alone, get started building the taxonomy, and bring them back in later to get some feedback. That's what we do when we do a professional services engagement. Get the feedback, but don't let them build the taxonomy. A taxonomy team should be building that. Another piece of advice, start with the SharePoint CSV format if possible. Excel is not a sophisticated tool, but it really does the job. You can download that import format from the term store or use the general business taxonomy format. It's great because you can make changes in the sheet, you can share it, you can get notes, get people's feedback, and then once you're pretty settled on your taxonomy or the start, then you import it into the term store and any edits get made from there going forward. Bear in mind you can't export from the term store, you can only import. So you want to have it be mostly happy with it before you bring it in. Last thing, don't try to build one giant taxonomy. I think that's a common pitfall. You imagine that, I'm Acme Corp, I need to build the Acme taxonomy. But in reality, the Acme taxonomy is made up of several different smaller taxonomies. You might have your human resources taxonomy. You might have a product name taxonomy. You might have one for customer segments, one for contract types, etc. So a good way to start is identify what are those term sets you need to build, and then identify which group might be more enthusiastic or what's a high-profile group. It might be human resources on an intranet because everyone's using that. And if you can get a good taxonomy and tag that content, people begin to see the value of the taxonomy and they'll be enthusiastic about doing it for their information. So you can iteratively roll out different groups and different taxonomies. Don't have to boil the ocean, to use a cliche. Here's a look at the template. Again, you can download that from SharePoint, just in SharePoint. This is the SharePoint format. Pretty easy to make changes and add a lot of terms at once, as opposed to one by one in the term store. So where Juan comes in is we try to help people build better taxonomies more quickly. And we use a foundation taxonomy approach. So the question you're going to come across is, do we build it or do we buy it or do we start from scratch? And the value we see out of a foundation taxonomy is it gives you that initial 75 or 80% boost to where you want to go. And it gives everybody a common sense starting point so that when you do work with the business users, they can actually look at something and say, we use an acronym there, or we call human resources HR, or we actually don't have life insurance benefits. You can delete that. So getting that specific feedback that's occurring at the very value-added level. And we just see that the foundation taxonomies tend to speed up the process of building a taxonomy so that people can move on to the actual business goal, which is providing better search to the end user. So the way we do that, and this is just a very small commercial in the webinar, but we make our taxonomy library available on a subscription basis. Basically gives you, for your subscription period, an unlimited access to the complete WAN taxonomy library. You can browse through any of the taxonomies and download branches of or complete taxonomies in SharePoint format. You get the regular updates. You get any new taxonomies that we develop. And it's really designed as a resource to help you build the taxonomy that you need for SharePoint. So you can imagine it as a grocery store. You're going to go in and pick the ingredients for the meal that you're trying to make. And you can see the man with the gasoline. Think of SharePoint as an engine. Taxonomy is a gasoline that you're going to put into that engine to make it run more efficiently. And again, the goal is we want to be a resource to help our customers build better taxonomies for SharePoint more quickly. Next, you have your taxonomies. What's your tagging strategy? There's a few approaches. You can do manual tagging, as we saw in SharePoint. If you want to enforce that, Some people will make required fields. You can do that. Be careful not to do too many required fields. You don't want to be overly burdensome on your end users. There's a few ways you can automatically assign metadata in SharePoint using inheritance or default values. Those are okay approaches. Just be aware that individual documents won't have specific metadata. They'll share metadata with all the other documents that are in the same place. So if I set a default value of, Twin Cities for a certain library or a certain document set, everything in that folder is going to get that value. Again, that might be okay, but you just have to weigh that against the value of having specific metadata for each document. And then last is an automatic tagging strategy. That would be an add-on for SharePoint. Again, Wand has a solution, Data Facet. There are other solutions out there with different approaches. And that just means when the user checks in the document, the metadata will be applied automatically. So the trade-off there is there's less work for the end user, but you do have to manage the process a little bit more. You either have to manage the rules or the training set depending on what technology the engine is using. And again, that's really just a business decision. Finally, make sure to have an ongoing governance plan. So taxonomies do change over time. It's not a set it and forget it type thing. Most SharePoint sites that are successful have a governance plan. Just make sure to include taxonomy management as part of that. That's basically going to be your policies and standards for when do we create a new term. Do we define terms? How do we manage reused terms? Term naming conventions, things as simple as capitalization, and do we use and or ampersand? Things that are going to develop consistency over time in the taxonomy. And consistency is important so that your user base has confidence in the taxonomy. And with that, we will jump to a Q&A, and we'll answer a few questions. I've took up the entire hour, so I'll answer a couple questions now. Again, if you have to go and we were not able to answer your question, I'll answer all the questions in the follow-up document to come tomorrow. So here's a good question. Are the terms available across site collections, or can they be specific to their own collection? Basically, how do terms get published out to different sites and site collections? So there's a few things here, and one of them relates back to what I was talking about earlier with setting up columns in the library. If you do the enterprise keywords column, basically any of the taxonomies that are in the term store at the site level, or at the site collection level, I should say, or the farm level, will be available to be tagged to any documents. So how can you control that if you want to? One is you can set up specific columns that are only linked to certain taxonomies. So if you have a finance library and you only want those documents tagged to finance terms, set up that specific column, disable the enterprise keywords column, and when people go to tag, they'll only have that universe of terms available to them. The other thing you can do, which is slightly more advanced, so it was out of the scope of this 101 webinar, is you can create term sets that are only available at the site level. So if you have a site and you want to create your own term set that is not available elsewhere, you can actually do that when you set up a library column. And let me see if I can show that very quickly. So when I create a column, again, I'm going to do manage metadata. And we'll do a made-up column name again. If you go down here, here's a customized term set. And you can see this defines it well here. A custom term set will be available to other users in your site collection. So site collection, to be clear. I think I just said site. Other users at the site collection, but its terms will not be offered in the enterprise keywords column. So this would be a term set that would be very specific to just my site collection. And that's the way that I can create custom terms at the site collection level. So I think that answers your question. There is a few things you can do from a flexibility standpoint. So next question, and this will be the last one, and then we'll wrap it up. By reviewing the keywords, is that used to tune the search indexes? Or how is search tuning done? So that's another good question. Search tuning is done a little bit in the term stores, as we saw with the dictionaries, the query spelling inclusions and exclusions. But otherwise, search tuning is not done inside the term stores. You want to look at other areas to do best bets, etc. Now, that being said, you may want to review that set of keywords and take that into account when you're doing search tuning of the search engine. But that's a different interface, not done directly within the term store. So just keep that in mind. The term store does link up, or it does benefit the search, but the best bets and things are still managed elsewhere. So that wraps it up. I want to thank everybody for attending today. I hope it was a valuable hour. There's a brief survey that will appear when you exit the webinar. I'd appreciate it if you'd fill that out. And if there's any questions that Juan can answer, if there's any way that Juan can help you with your taxonomy project, please don't hesitate to reach out. My contact details are listed here. Additionally, you can specifically request somebody to contact you in the exit survey. But with that, thank you very much. It's been my pleasure to give the webinar today, and I hope everybody has learned quite a bit. And again, look forward to helping anybody who we can with your taxonomy project.